The year is 1943. The world is burning with the largest war in human history, and for the first time in the modern era, thousands of women are wearing military uniforms. American women have joined the Women's Army Corps, working in communications and intelligence close to the front lines. British women are flying aircraft as part of the Air Transport Auxiliary, ferrying planes from factories to airfields through contested skies. French women are fighting in resistance networks, blowing up supply lines, and passing intelligence through enemy-occupied territory. These women believe they are fighting under the same rules of war as the men beside them. Many of them are about to discover they are wrong in ways that will not be spoken of publicly for more than half a century. Lieutenant Mary Collins never expected to become a prisoner. As a Women's Army Corps officer in Italy, she was managing radio communications for advancing Allied forces, working a few miles behind the front lines near Monte Cassino. When German armored units broke through in a surprise attack, Mary and 4 other WAC officers were caught in the chaos. There was nowhere to run. When German soldiers brought them to the captain in command, his reaction was not rage or contempt. It was something more unsettling, a calculating curiosity. He looked them over slowly. "Women in uniforms," he said. "How interesting. America sends its daughters to die in foreign mud." Something in his expression made Mary's skin go cold. It wasn't the standard look of an enemy taking prisoners. There was something else there. Something that understood exactly what he intended to do with them. Mary told him clearly that they were military personnel, pointing to her lieutenant's bars, invoking the Geneva Convention. He smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. "The Geneva Convention," he repeated, "protects soldiers, not women playing at war." He turned to his men and spoke in German. Mary didn't understand the words, but she watched the way the soldiers' eyes changed as they looked at her and the other women. She would later describe this as the moment she first understood what real fear was. 300 miles north, on the same day, British Air Transport Auxiliary pilot Sarah Bennett was climbing from the wreckage of a Spitfire she had been delivering to an airfield near Paris when German anti-aircraft fire found her. She was alive. She had her Royal Air Force uniform. She had her identification. She had trained for capture and knew the protocols: name, rank, serial number. She repeated it clearly when German patrols found her in a farmer's barn before sunset. The senior officer who processed her was older, with cold eyes. He made a note in a small book, then looked up at her with the faint beginning of a smile. "You will not be going to a regular prisoner camp, Fräulein Bennett," he said. "Your unusual situation requires special handling." Across France, Belgium, and Italy, this scene played out dozens of times, through 1943 and into 1944. American, British, and French women in military service falling into German hands. Each time, the pattern was identical: immediate separation from male prisoners, special classification, different processing. A memo from German High Command dated June 1943, found only after the war ended, contained explicit instructions for handling what it called female enemy combatants. The language was clinical and precise. These women were not to be processed through standard POW channels. Their status as women who had voluntarily abandoned normal feminine roles made them subject to specialized protocols. A second document, kept classified until 1995, directed German officers that Western female military personnel were to be classified as morally compromised women who had surrendered the protections normally afforded to their sex, and that their treatment should reflect this classification. By late 1943, Germany had constructed an entire shadow system for captured Allied women. No Red Cross inspections, no prisoner exchanges, no oversight from any international body. While male prisoners entered the established POW camp network where international rules were at least partially observed, captured women were taken somewhere else entirely. Mary Collins later told military investigators, in a report that remained classified until 2006, that she and the other women were loaded onto a separate truck while the male prisoners were put on regular transport. One of the German guards said to another that these ones go to the special facility. The way he smiled when he said it told her everything she needed to know about what was waiting. The planning for what would happen to these women had begun before any of them were captured. In a meeting at SS headquarters in 1942, officers from intelligence, medicine, and psychology had gathered to create what they called Protocol 27 specialized procedures for female military captives. The meeting's minutes, discovered decades later, revealed a level of premeditation that made the events that followed even more chilling. SS Colonel Werner Haas wrote that the female enemy soldier presented both a challenge and an opportunity, that their presence on battlefields was an aberration that could be exploited, that their capture allowed study of what he called Western perversion, while simultaneously developing methods to break their unusually strong resistance. The Germans had analyzed Allied recruitment materials, studied training procedures, and developed specific techniques designed to exploit what they had identified as women's unique psychological vulnerabilities. This wasn't battlefield cruelty, it was calculated, documented science. The first thing the Germans took from captured women soldiers was not weapons or intelligence, it was dignity. When Mary Collins and the other American women arrived at an unmarked building in the early morning hours, they were immediately separated from each other. A German woman officer in a crisp uniform, not medical, not administrative, but something trained specifically for this purpose, directed them through what German records called processing. It was cold in the room. The lights were harsh. Guards stood watching. When Mary invoked the Geneva Convention again, the officer cut her off with a short laugh. "That agreement," she said, "is for soldiers. You are women who have forgotten your place. Your processing will reflect that." What followed was recorded in German files as an examination. Years later, researchers would find photographs from these sessions not in military identification records, but in the private collections of camp commanders. They were trophies, not documentation. Sarah Bennett, held at a facility near Paris, described the experience in a diary she kept hidden throughout her captivity. The most shocking part, she wrote, was how organized it all was. This wasn't random cruelty. They had a system, forms to fill out, special rooms set up specifically for women prisoners. They had been planning this long before any of us arrived. The examinations lasted hours. Women were measured, photographed from every angle, subjected to invasive physical procedures conducted by German doctors whose clinical detachment made everything worse. All of it was recorded in precise language in files marked Female Prisoner Processing Protocol. A document found after the war explained the purpose in terms that were transparent in their horror. Western women who take military roles maintain psychological strength through identification with male soldiers. This identification must be systematically dismantled. Their status as females must be emphasized through processing designed to create shame and awareness of vulnerability. In direct language, the Germans intended to make these women forget they were soldiers and remember only that they were women who could be hurt in ways male prisoners could not. For French resistance women, the process was worse still. Without uniforms or formal military status, they were classified as female terrorists, subject to public humiliation conducted before assembled German troops, forced to stand in courtyards, while officers delivered lectures about women who had betrayed their natural roles. A French prisoner named Elise Dupont told Allied investigators after liberation what she had been subjected to during this phase. Her testimony breaks off in the official transcript at a specific point. The male officer taking her statement wrote that the subject became too emotional to continue. What he actually meant was that her description was too disturbing for him to record. After processing, the women received not the uniforms issued to male prisoners, but civilian dresses often too small, frequently inadequate for the temperature, nothing underneath, thin slippers rather than shoes. When Mary Collins demanded proper POW treatment and complained about the cold, a guard asked her whether she wanted to be treated like a soldier. "Soldiers endure hardship without complaint," he said. "Consider this your first test." That night, the temperature in the women's quarters dropped to near freezing. They moved together for warmth, strangers becoming something closer through shared suffering. This became their first act of resistance, though they didn't recognize it as such yet. German records show at least 15 specialized female detention centers operating by 1944, each following the same procedures refined through what the documents called operational experience, each designed to break women in specific ways, different from the methods used on men. A training manual for guards discovered in archives decades later described the theory behind the approach with the specific coldness of bureaucratic language. Female prisoners require psychological conditioning before interrogation. Their sense of modesty and gender must be exploited. Conditions should be created where they must choose between dignity and cooperation, all responses to be documented for research purposes. That word research appears throughout the German records on female prisoners. They weren't only holding these women, they were studying them, learning what worked, refining their methods. At the secure facilities where women with military intelligence training or leadership positions were sent, German intelligence officers implemented what their own documents called enhanced female interrogation protocols. This language concealed practices that, when the files were eventually found by Allied investigators, were immediately classified at the highest levels. They were considered too disturbing for public knowledge. Mary Collins testified in a report sealed by American authorities until 2001 that the first night she was taken for what was called night questioning, she was brought not to a standard interrogation room, but to an officer's private quarters. There were 3 men waiting. One of them told her they would now see if an American woman soldier was as tough as she pretended to be. The transcript notes that Mary stopped speaking for several minutes before she could continue. German interrogation doctrine for female prisoners, as reconstructed from surviving documents, was based on a specific psychological theory about Western women in military service. A training document told interrogators that female enemy personnel from Western nations maintained psychological resistance through their identification as soldiers, and that this could be broken through methods emphasizing their status as women, that their cultural background made them especially susceptible to shame and to fear of what the document called moral compromise. In direct terms, the Germans believed they could break Western women not just physically, but by attacking their sense of themselves as decent people, by creating experiences they would be ashamed to describe and therefore unable to process or report. Elise Dupont described how German officers used the youngest women in a group as leverage against the older ones. They would bring in the youngest girl, 19 years old, and tell Elise that either she answered their questions or they would make her watch what happened to the girl. "What choice did I have?" Elise said. But the next day, there would be new questions, new threats. It never ended. British SOE agent reports, kept secret for decades after the war, describe night interrogations conducted in officers' quarters rather than standard questioning rooms. Every session recorded in clinical German notes that rated each technique for effectiveness. German female guards from specialized SS units often participated in these interrogations. These women had been selected and trained to handle what Nazi ideology called gender traitors, women who had violated proper female roles by serving in military capacities. Some accounts suggest the female guards were among the most severe participants, viewing the prisoners as a disgrace to all women. Sarah wrote in her hidden diary about the woman who ran their section. She would tell them daily that they deserved everything that happened to them, that real women stayed home and supported their country in appropriate ways, that by putting on uniforms they had chosen to be treated like soldiers, or worse than soldiers. She would help hold them down. She would watch and take notes. Sometimes, Sarah wrote, she seemed to enjoy it more than the male officers did. The Germans documented everything with the systematic precision that characterized the Third Reich's administration of its worst acts. They created individual files on each woman, noting which approaches were most effective in breaking resistance. They conducted what they called comparative studies on women from different countries, testing whether American, British, or French prisoners responded differently to various methods. Some of these records were destroyed as Allied forces advanced, but enough survived to make the systematic nature of what happened undeniable. Most significant was the evidence that senior German leadership knew and approved of these methods at the highest levels. A memo from SS headquarters dated September 1943 specifically authorized special measures for female combatants and requested regular reports evaluating the effectiveness of gender-specific techniques. This was not a few bad officers acting outside their orders. It was official policy, designed at command level, implemented across all facilities holding female military prisoners. In December 1944, as Allied forces approached Germany, Heinrich Himmler personally ordered a reassessment of the female prisoner program. A conference was convened in Berlin, where officers from various facilities presented their findings. Among the most notable was a report from the facility near Frankfurt that described complete failure of their methods with Soviet women pilots, but significant success with American and British prisoners. French resistance women fell somewhere between. The Germans had expected national characteristics to determine which women broke most easily. What they discovered instead was that individual factors mattered more than nationality, prior trauma history, quality of military training, and personal psychological resilience predicted outcomes more reliably than country of origin. This finding led to changes in classification procedures during the final months of the war, with prisoners being categorized by psychological profile rather than military background. But something happened inside these facilities that the Germans had not anticipated and could not engineer away. The women resisted, not through dramatic confrontations. Those had consequences that were severe and immediate. They resisted through the small, persistent, invisible acts of solidarity that the German system couldn't fully detect or prevent. They formed bonds with each other. They developed codes to communicate when guards weren't present. Each night, in whispers, they recited their ranks and units to each other. They told stories of their training and their service before capture. They reminded each other, we are soldiers first. What they do to our bodies doesn't change who we are. We are still fighting, just on a different battlefield. Mary Collins wrote in a journal she kept hidden in a crack in the wall that they would tell these things to each other to keep themselves from forgetting what they actually were. This took a specific kind of courage. Each morning, women who had been taken away for questioning the night before returned bruised and broken. The others would help clean them up, share what small amounts of water they were given, whisper words of strength. When the Germans offered better food or warmer clothes to women who would inform on others, the offers were almost never accepted. When they isolated women they identified as leaders, the leaders found ways to maintain contact anyway. Sarah wrote about an American wax sergeant who was taken every night for 2 weeks. When they brought her back, she couldn't walk, but she had never said a word beyond her name and serial number. When the Germans finally gave up on her and threw her back with the others, that night she whispered the Pledge of Allegiance to the women in her room. Still a soldier, still fighting. As 1,944 progressed and Allied forces pushed toward Germany, the conditions in these facilities deteriorated further. The Germans began destroying records and moving prisoners deeper into their territory. They knew what they had done would be considered war crimes, and they moved to eliminate the evidence. Some women were transferred so many times that their own governments lost track of them entirely. For Mary, Sarah, Elise, and hundreds like them, survival became the only victory available. Each day alive was another battle won. Each small act of resistance was a kind of triumph against a system specifically designed to make them believe resistance was impossible. In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany, they began finding the facilities where female military personnel had been held. The liberating soldiers were not prepared for what they found. Women in conditions that went beyond what the soldiers had seen in standard POW camps, injuries and trauma that the male officers literally did not know how to address or even how to describe in their reports. Some of the women couldn't speak at all. Others couldn't stop. Words coming out in torrents about what had been done to them over months or years. Lieutenant Mary Collins was among those liberated from a facility near Munich. When American soldiers broke through the doors, she weighed 85 pounds. Her hair had turned partially white. She was 26 years old. She told the young sergeant who found them clearly and directly, "We are American wax. We are soldiers, like you." He wrote in his report afterward that he cried when she said those words. The joy of liberation lasted a very short time before the women noticed something disturbing about how they were being handled compared to male prisoners. Male POWs were celebrated, given immediate medical attention, prepared for the homecoming stories that newspapers wanted to publish. The women were separated from other freed prisoners, handled cautiously, questioned by officers who were often visibly uncomfortable with what they were hearing. Sarah Bennett wrote in the final pages of her hidden diary that no photographers came to take their pictures the way they had come for the men. No reporters asked for their stories. A colonel told them that certain parts of their experience were classified and they were not to speak of them, ever, to anyone. At the special hospitals where the women were taken, military intelligence officers conducted debriefings unlike anything male prisoners underwent. The questioning went on for days, conducted by male officers with no training in trauma and no framework for understanding what these women had experienced. The questions focused heavily not on military intelligence the women might possess, but on the precise details of what had been done to them, every detail recorded, every account documented. Then the files were stamped, classified, and locked away. When the process was over, the women were asked to sign papers. One was a standard military debriefing form. The other stated that they agreed never to share certain experiences with anyone, not doctors, not family members, not fellow veterans. The reason given was national security. Elise Dupont said the major interviewing her couldn't look her in the eye. When she described what happened during the night interrogations, his hand shook badly enough to spill his coffee. At the end, he handed her the papers to sign without comment. These secrecy agreements were standard for women prisoners. They were not standard for men. A memo from American military intelligence, discovered decades later, explained the reasoning with a directness that now reads as its own kind of atrocity. Detailed accounts of specialized enemy treatment of female military personnel could cause serious public relations issues and impact future recruitment of women. These experiences, while regrettable, do not serve any intelligence purpose and should be sealed. In plain terms, what had happened to these women was going to make the public angry and might discourage other women from joining the military, so their stories needed to disappear. The women who had endured the worst were considered a liability to be managed, not survivors to be honored. When they went home, the world didn't want what they were carrying. Parades welcomed male soldiers back as heroes. Newspapers ran celebration stories. Everyone wanted victory narratives, not what these women had to tell. Many of them tried. Most found that the world either didn't want to hear or couldn't process what they described. The systematic, documented, officially sanctioned nature of what had been done to them was so far outside what people were prepared to believe about the European war that many simply preferred to think the women were exaggerating or confused. People would say the Germans were civilized enemies. Not like the Japanese, Mary Collins wrote. They had this idea that Europeans wouldn't do such things. When I tried to explain that it wasn't a few bad officers, but an actual written system with procedures and records, they would change the subject. Even other veterans didn't want to hear it. It was easier to believe we were making it up or crazy. The medical treatment they received back home made their situation worse. Male doctors in military hospitals had no understanding of what these women had experienced. Women suffering from what we now call post-traumatic stress were diagnosed with female hysteria or nervous conditions. Their physical injuries from captivity were misdiagnosed or ignored. Sarah wrote in 1946 about a doctor who stopped her mid-explanation and said that what she was describing wasn't relevant to her treatment. He prescribed sleeping pills and suggested she focus on more feminine pursuits to take her mind off dwelling on the past. As if I could just forget, she wrote. Their own governments were actively working to ensure their stories didn't reach public record. Military files about female POWs were heavily edited. Reports that described what had been done to them were classified above the level of atomic research. When histories of the war were written in the following decades, these women's experiences were simply absent. A British intelligence memo from 1947, declassified in 2010, instructed that references to specialized enemy treatment of female personnel be removed from all public records, that such information served no historical purpose and could damage public morale and international relations in the post-war period. Many of the women kept silent not only because of the secrecy agreements they had signed, but because the world they returned to gave them no context in which to speak. Some who tried to tell their stories were called liars or attention seekers. Others found that people simply chose not to engage with what they were describing. The silence lasted decades. Many of them went to their graves without ever speaking the full truth to anyone, including their own families. Sarah Bennett married in 1947, but she never had children. She wrote to a former fellow prisoner in 1952 that she couldn't bear to be touched for years and that her husband thought it was because of some physical problem. "I've never told him the real reason," she wrote. "We're all still keeping the secrets they told us to keep." It was the 1980s before historians began to find the edges of what had been buried. As wartime records were slowly and partially declassified, researchers began noticing patterns in scattered documents, references to specialized facilities for female prisoners, medical reports with sections completely blacked out, gaps in prisoner transfer records where women's names should have appeared. In 1985, Professor Helen Richards began systematically interviewing surviving women who had been military prisoners. At first, very few would speak with her. Then, slowly, as these women reached their 60s and 70s, some began to talk. They were tired of carrying it alone. They were tired of the official silence. They wanted the truth known before they died. Elise Dupont told Richards in 1987 that it wasn't only what the Germans had done to them, it was what their own countries did afterward. They told us to forget. They hid our reports. They treated us as if we had done something shameful by surviving. We were betrayed twice, first by our captors, then by our own people. In 1995, a cache of German documents was found in a former Stasi archive in East Berlin. The files included training manuals for handling female prisoners and evaluation reports on the effectiveness of different interrogation methods. The clinical language couldn't conceal what was described. For the first time, there was documentary evidence from the German side that confirmed everything the surviving women had been saying for decades. The first formal acknowledgement by the American government came in 2001 when selected files about women POWs were declassified. A small ceremony honored the surviving women, who were then in their 80s. No press was invited. No public statement was issued. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a truth that had been hidden for more than 50 years. Mary Collins didn't live to see that day. She died in 1988, her story still largely untold. But she had left behind letters and journals hidden in her attic, discovered by a niece cleaning out her house. In one of the last entries, she wrote, "Someday someone will want to know what really happened to us. Someday people will be ready to hear the truth. I write this for that day, though I don't expect to see it. Some burdens you carry your whole life, hoping the next generation won't have to." The story of what happened to women military prisoners in the Second World War sits at the intersection of several failures that are difficult to look at directly. The failure of the laws of war to protect people they were supposed to protect. The failure of Allied governments to acknowledge and investigate what their own personnel had suffered. The failure of medical and intelligence services to treat survivors as survivors rather than problems to be contained. And the failure of collective memory to include experiences that didn't fit the narrative of a clean and righteous war. Mary Collins was 26 years old and weighed 85 pounds when she was liberated from a facility near Munich. She had been managing radio communications for Allied forces when German tanks broke through at Monte Cassino. She was a military officer doing her job. She told her captors she was a soldier with rights under the Geneva Convention. They told her the convention protected soldiers, not women playing at war. She spent 2 years in a shadow system that German High Command had specifically designed for women like her, documented in memos and training manuals that officials on her own side then classified for decades because the truth was inconvenient. Sarah Bennett was delivering a Spitfire to an airfield near Paris when she was shot down. She had her uniform, her identification, her training for capture. None of it mattered. She was put in a facility near Paris and then moved again, and she kept a diary hidden in a crack in her cell, writing down what was happening to her so that someday, if she survived, there would be a record that could not be erased. She survived. She came home. A colonel told her certain parts of her experience were classified, and she was not to speak of them ever to anyone. She died carrying most of what she had written down. Elise Dupont blew up German supply trains in occupied France. She passed intelligence through enemy lines. She was captured without a uniform and classified as a female terrorist, a category that placed her below the protections extended to male POWs and below the protections extended to civilian women. She told Allied investigators what happened to her after the war ended. The transcript of her testimony breaks off in the official record at a specific point. The male officer taking the statement wrote that the subject became too emotional to continue. What actually happened was that her description was too disturbing for him to write down, and then it was classified, and then it was forgotten. And then these women died, one by one, carrying it. This is what they carried. This is what was done to them. This is what was hidden. And this is what they were when all of it was over. Still soldiers, still fighting, whispering their ranks and units to each other in the dark, reminding each other who they were, because the system built to break them never understood that the thing it was trying to destroy was the one thing it couldn't reach. They were soldiers. That's what they kept telling everyone. from the moment of capture to the moment of liberation, and every moment after. They were right. They were soldiers. And they deserved to have someone finally say so.